Long before kings wore crowns, before prophets spoke of redemption, there was a woman who broke every rule to awaken divine justice. Her name was Tamar, a widow cast aside, a soul forgotten by her own blood. But heaven does not forget. They say when her veil dropped beneath the moonlight, a kingdom's fate began to tremble. Was it sin, or was it prophecy disguised as scandal? Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this one move your heart, make sure to subscribe. The desert remembers what men choose to forget. When you walk through the dry lands of Judah, beneath the weight of the ancient sun, the earth itself whispers the names of those who defied their fate. Tamar's name still lingers there, not as a sinner, not as a saint, but as a mystery caught between heaven and judgment. Imagine standing where she once stood, a narrow road winding through dust and silence, olive trees bending in the heat, and the air heavy with the scent of unanswered prayers. Her story begins not with triumph, but with silence, the silence of injustice. Tamar was a young woman bound by sacred law, yet betrayed by those who claimed to uphold it. She was promised a future through marriage to the sons of Judah, the great patriarch whose bloodline would one day shape prophecy itself. But one by one, those promises turned to ashes. Her first husband, was struck down. The scriptures say he was wicked in the sight of the Lord. The second, Onan, refused to honor the sacred duty of brotherhood, spilling his seed in defiance of divine command. And Tamar, she waited, she obeyed, she mourned. Yet no one came for her. Judah himself, the man who should have protected her, sent her away, veiled in shame, promising that his last son, Shelah, would one day marry her. But years passed, and that promise became a lie carried on the wind. They thought she would fade into obscurity, like so many women of her time, silenced by law, erased by memory. But Tamar's spirit was carved from something divine, the fierce intelligence of a woman who understood that God's justice does not always follow man's order. The world around her moved on. Festivals filled the town. Judah's flocks prospered, and in that prosperity her name was never spoken again. Yet heaven was watching. For every forgotten promise, every broken vow, the divine clock continued to turn. One evening, when the harvest moon rose full and red above the hills, Tamar made a choice that would shock generations. She heard that Judah, her father-in-law, the man who had cast her aside, was traveling to Timnah to shear his sheep. The road he would take passed through the crossroads of Enaim, a place where dust met destiny. And there, Tamar wrapped herself in a veil, not the veil of mourning, but the veil of transformation. In that single act, she stepped beyond human law into the realm of divine reckoning. Her disguise was not deception. It was prophecy wearing human skin. Can you imagine the silence of that moment? The way the air must have trembled as she sat by the roadside waiting, her face hidden, her heart burning with both fear and faith. For in her heart she must have wondered, was I wronged by man, or chosen by God to reveal his hidden justice? When Judah approached, he did not see his daughter-in-law. He saw only a veiled woman, a symbol of desire and mystery. The transaction that followed was not one of lust, but of destiny. A staff, a seal, and a cord, symbols of identity, of authority, were exchanged that night. And in that exchange, divine irony was born. Days later, when Tamar's belly began to swell, the world called her a sinner. Judah ordered her to be burned, the punishment for adultery. Yet as the fire was prepared, Tamar sent forth the very symbols he had left behind, the seal, the cord, the staff. Proof that the man who condemned her was the very man who had created the life within her. And in that moment, silence fell over Judah's household. The flames died down, the whisper stopped, and Judah, the patriarch himself, fell to his knees saying the words that would echo through eternity. She is more righteous than I. But what if I told you? That wasn't the end. What if I told you that Tamar's act, scandalous to men, sacred to heaven, set into motion a prophecy that would one day lead to a carpenter from Nazareth, born of the same line she fought to preserve? Because sometimes the hand of God moves through the hands of the condemned. Soft pause. Desert wind rises again, and that, dear listener, is where our journey begins, in the dust of Judah's road where shame became salvation, and deception became divine truth. The story begins in the valley where dust meets dawn, where every sunrise feels ancient, as if time itself still kneels before its creator. It is here, in the shadow of the hills of Hebron, that the story of Tamar first stirs, not as a whisper of scandal, but as a tremor of prophecy waiting to be born. The land of Judah was vast then, vineyards climbing the ridges, olive trees bowing under the weight of their fruit, and shepherds guiding flocks that glittered like stars under the sun. The people lived by law and lineage. Names carried weight, bloodlines defined destiny, and among those names was Judah, son of Jacob, the man whose father wrestled with God and survived. Judah's name meant praise, yet his house would soon be haunted by silence. Tamar entered that world as an outsider, a woman from beyond the familiar hills, chosen for her beauty, but destined for something far greater than beauty could promise. When she first walked into Judah's household, the air itself seemed to change. Servants spoke quietly. Doors creaked in hesitation. Some said the wind paused to listen when she prayed. Judah's firstborn heir was given to her in marriage. Scripture tells us little of him, only that he was wicked in the sight of the Lord. But imagine for a moment what wickedness might mean in a world built on covenant. Perhaps arrogance, perhaps cruelty, perhaps the quiet sin of neglect, the refusal to honor a wife not as property but as purpose. Tamar bore it all in silence. She prayed when the nights grew long. She lit lamps and whispered psalms while air vanished into darkness. And when the divine decree fell, when was struck down without warning, the torches in the courtyard burned all night long, for the house of Judah had lost its first son. Custom demanded that Tamar not be left alone. The sacred law of levirate marriage, that a man should marry his brother's widow to preserve the family's line, now fell upon Onan, Judah's second son. The ceremony was quiet, but the tension was not. Onan took her hand but not her heart. He lay beside her but never beside her destiny. He wanted the pleasure of her body, but not the burden of her womb. For he knew that any child born to Tamar would not carry his name, it would belong to his dead brother. And so he defied divine command. He took what was meant for legacy and turned it into waste. The act was seen not by man but by heaven. And once again judgment fell. When Onan died, fear spread like sickness through Judah's house. Whispers began. This woman, she is cursed. Tamar was sent away, veiled in mourning, told to wait until Judah's third son, Shelah, was old enough to marry her. But behind Judah's promise there was hesitation, the kind that grows from superstition and guilt. Deep down, Judah feared her. He saw her as an omen, not a daughter. As the days turned to months and months to years, his promise faded like footprints in sand. Tamar returned to her father's house, not as a wife, not as a widow, but as something in between. Society had no name for her kind. A woman waiting for a destiny others refused to give her. She lived quietly. The seasons passed. Shelah grew older, yet no messenger came, no word from Judah. Only silence, heavy, endless, holy silence. But heaven was not silent. Each dawn, as the first light touched her window, Tamar would rise to pray. Her hands, calloused from work, trembled against the clay floor. And somewhere in that stillness, a voice older than time seemed to stir. Not in words, but in feeling. A promise, a pulse, a sense that her life had not been abandoned, only delayed. She did not know it yet, but she was chosen to preserve a bloodline that would one day carry redemption itself. Years later, Judah's wife died. The news reached Tamar like thunder. The man who had cast her aside was now cloaked in grief, wandering unmoored. It was said he planned to travel north, to the town of Timnah for the sheep shearing festival, a time of feasting, wine, and ritual cleansing. The women in Tamar's village whispered of it. He will pass through the road near Enaim, they said, where the merchants rest and the watchmen change shifts. That night, Tamar could not sleep. The moon was a thin blade in the sky, cutting through her thoughts. She sat by the fire, her eyes reflecting its light, her hands trembling over the fabric of her mourning veil. How long had she waited? How long had she obeyed? And what had obedience given her but exile and emptiness? Then something stirred inside her. Not rebellion, but revelation. A divine whisper, subtle yet undeniable. What if obedience to injustice was not faith, but fear disguised as virtue? What if the God of Abraham, the God of justice, was waiting for her to act? The next morning, Tamar rose before the sun. She dressed not as a widow, but as a mystery. Her fingers tied the veil over her face, layer by layer, until her reflection was no longer hers. It was the face of prophecy itself. She took the road toward Enaim, her footsteps slow, steady, silent. Each step echoed through eternity. Each breath was a prayer and a defiance. Each heartbeat was a vow that heaven would see her truth. The dust lifted around her like smoke. The fields stretched wide, golden and trembling under the weight of the noon light. And in that vast emptiness, Tamar became both seen and unseen, the embodiment of every woman denied justice yet chosen by destiny. When Judah approached, his robes brushed the earth, his face weary from travel. He did not recognize her. The veil hid what truth could not yet reveal. To him, she was just another roadside figure, a woman of the night, nameless, disposable. But heaven saw more. Heaven saw a covenant about to be rewritten through deception that was not deception, but divine symmetry, a mirror to the injustices Judah himself had sown. When Judah spoke, his words were casual, transactional. "Let me come in unto thee," he said, a phrase simple yet heavy with consequence. And Tamar, steady as the wind before a storm, replied not with words of lust, but of law. "What will you give me that you may come in unto me?" A bargain was struck, not for coin, not for grain, but for symbols. His seal, his cord, and his staff, the marks of his identity, authority, and lineage. Unknowingly, Judah placed his entire legacy into her hands, and so the veil became the bridge between law and prophecy. What man saw as seduction, heaven recorded as justice. What Judah thought was sin, God knew as salvation beginning to unfold. That night, beneath the whispering trees, destiny shifted. The stars burned brighter, as though heaven itself leaned closer to watch. Tamar conceived, and with that conception, the lineage of kings and prophets began, though no one yet understood. When the dawn came, she vanished. The road returned to silence. Judah continued to Timnah, unaware that his seed had been sown into eternity. Weeks passed. Seasons turned. And then the whispers began again, cruel, cutting, predictable. Tamar's with child. Judah's face hardened. The very man who had denied her justice now demanded punishment. "Bring her forth," he commanded, "that she may be burned." But Tamar did not tremble. She sent a message instead, quiet, devastating, divine. "The man whose these are, the seal, the cord, and the staff, he is the Father." And in that moment, every veil dropped. Every hypocrisy burned. Judah saw himself reflected in his own sin, and the world saw justice rewritten by a woman the world had tried to erase. He fell to his knees, trembling, whispering the words that redeemed his own soul. "She is more righteous than I." From that moment on, heaven's gaze lingered differently upon her, for Tamar had not only secured her place in the house of Judah, she had preserved the bloodline from which David and later, the Messiah himself would come. Through her pain, prophecy breathed. Through her defiance, destiny unfolded. Through her silence, salvation found its first cry. And yet, there is more, for even now, beneath the sands of ancient Judah, stories remain buried, relics of her name, traces of her passage, echoes of her prayer. Some say that in the caves near Timnah, faint inscriptions once marked the tale of the Veiled One, the woman who carried light beneath her sorrow. Others say that on certain nights when the wind passes through the valley, one can hear her voice, calm, strong, timeless, whispering not of vengeance, but of victory through faith, because Tamar was never meant to be remembered as the woman who tricked a king's son. She was meant to be remembered as the woman who taught heaven's justice to speak through human hands, and that is how origins begin, not with birth, but with awakening. Soft music swells. Desert wind returns. But this is only the beginning, for soon, divine secrets buried in her lineage will rise again, mysteries that connect her act of courage to prophecies stretching across centuries. And that's when the prophecy began to unfold. The night after Judah spoke the words, "She is more righteous than I," the sky above Hebron seemed to exhale. Clouds drifted apart as though the heavens themselves had witnessed justice reborn in an unexpected form. Yet peace did not come easily. Justice in the world of men rarely arrives without consequence. And for Judah and Tamar, the aftermath was not silence, but a storm. Judah returned to his home with heavy steps. Every doorway, every torchlight reminded him of what he had done, not just the act of deception, but the years of neglect that had forced her hand. He was a man of power and heritage, yet in his heart, he now felt like a servant to guilt. The staff and the seal he had once held with pride now burned in his memory like fire. He avoided the eyes of his household. When his servants spoke, he answered briefly. When his sons called, he turned away. In the hall where laughter once echoed, only the sound of footsteps and whispers remained. And yet, amid that quiet torment, something else stirred. A voice, not of shame, but of awakening. For the first time, Judah understood what his father Jacob had meant when he spoke of wrestling with God. Some battles are not fought in deserts or dreams. They are fought within the soul, between pride and repentance. Meanwhile, Tamar carried life within her. Her body changed, her heart strengthened, and her solitude deepened. The world still saw her as the widow who sinned, the woman who defied law for her own desire. But heaven saw her differently, as a vessel of justice chosen to bear what history would call the seed of promise. Still, Tamar was human, and in the stillness of her father's home, when the candles flickered low, fear whispered through her mind. Had she done right? Had her act been faith or folly wrapped in courage? Would God forgive what man condemned? There were nights she wept without sound, tears falling silently on the floor, mingling with the ashes of yesterday's fire. She prayed in words too fragile to be spoken. If I have sinned, let my sin serve your will. If I have obeyed, let my obedience bring light where darkness reigns. And heaven, though silent, listened. Months passed. Her belly grew heavy with twins, a symbol of duality, of conflict and continuation, of two destinies entwined. The midwives whispered that such births were rare, touched by something beyond human understanding. Some feared it, others revered it. But Tamar herself understood one truth: what is born through trial carries the mark of divine purpose. As her due time approached, word reached Judah. He had not spoken her name aloud since that fateful day, but her memory haunted him. In the markets, in the fields, he heard fragments of her story spoken by strangers. Some mocked her, others pitied her. But one elder, an old shepherd by the gate, said something Judah never forgot. You can burn a field, my lord, but if the seed is true, it will rise through the ashes. That night Judah could not sleep. He went out into the courtyard and looked at the stars, the same stars his grandfather Abraham once counted, when God promised that his descendants would be as numerous as the heavens. For the first time, he wondered if those descendants depended not on his strength but on the courage of a woman he had wronged. The conflict within him grew sharper with each passing day. He could not escape the truth. The same God who judged had also shown mercy through a woman's defiance. What was divine law then, if not the measure of both justice and compassion? In the distance, Tamar's labor began. It was a night thick with storm clouds. Lightning flickered over the hills, painting the world in white flashes. The cries of the midwives rose and fell like waves, mingled with prayers and chants of ancient rhythm. And then, confusion. For one child reached out first, his tiny hand breaking through before retreating again. The midwife, startled, tied a scarlet thread around his wrist, saying, "This one came first." But the second child burst forth before him, crying into the thunder as though declaring victory over fate itself. They named him Perez, meaning he who breaks through. The second child was called Zerah, meaning shining dawn. Perez, the breach, the defiance, the unstoppable force. Zerah, the light, the symbol of grace that follows after. Two children born of scandal and salvation carried the paradox of heaven and earth within them. And through Perez, the lineage of kings would one day rise, Boaz, David, and eventually the Messiah himself. But in that moment, Tamar held them not as prophecy, but as flesh and miracle. She looked into their faces and saw no sin, no shame, and only life. Life that refused to be silenced. Life that had fought its way through fire and judgment to exist. When Judah heard of the birth, he came quietly, without escort or herald. He stood at the edge of her doorway unseen, listening to the soft cries of the infants and the murmured prayers of the women. For the first time since his youth, tears blurred his vision. He stepped forward, hesitating, then spoke softly. A whisper meant more for heaven than for her. "Tamar, you have done what I could not. You have faced God without fear." She did not answer, only bowed her head, and for the first time Judah felt small, white, not in shame but in awe. He understood now that righteousness was not inherited through birthright or law, but chosen through courage. Days passed. The land began to heal. The whispers of scandal faded into stories of wonder. Some said the hand of God had touched Judah's house again. Others said the curse had lifted. But Judah himself knew the truth. The curse had never been Tamar. The curse had been cowardice, broken now by faith disguised as defiance. Still, in the silence between prayers, another conflict stirred, one that reached beyond their lives. For even as Tamar's children grew, there were those in the tribe who resented her, men who said, "This woman has mocked the order of God." Elders who feared her story would inspire rebellion among the daughters of Israel. And so, her name was rarely spoken. Her deeds rarely praised. But heaven wrote her name in fire across the scrolls of eternity, where no human hand could erase it. Generations would pass before anyone understood. But deep in the spiritual fabric of creation, Tamar's act became a lesson that sometimes divine justice wears the mask of scandal to expose the hypocrisy of men. Centuries later, prophets would speak of justice rolling down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. But Tamar had already lived that truth in silence, in sorrow, in unyielding faith. Even now, in the unseen realm, her name is whispered alongside those who defied despair. Rahab, Ruth, Esther, women who turned the impossible into the inevitable, each of them a mirror of Tamar's courage, each of them carrying a spark of that same divine fire. And yet, there remained one more shadow, one last storm before peace. Judah, though forgiven, was not free from the memories of his betrayal. In dreams, he saw Tamar's veiled face turning toward him in the half-light, her eyes neither accusing nor forgiving, only knowing. He would wake drenched in sweat, whispering prayers to a God who now felt closer, yet far more mysterious. Years later, when famine struck the land and his sons went down into Egypt seeking grain, Judah would again face a reckoning, this time with his own brother Joseph, whom he had once betrayed. And in that moment his voice would tremble not from fear, but from understanding. For he had learned mercy not from angels or kings, but from a widow who once sat beside the road, veiled in destiny. Tamar's conflict had become Judah's redemption. Her courage had become his confession. And through both, the divine narrative unfolded, not of sin punished, but of truth revealed. Even now, when the desert wind passes through the valley of Timnah, it carries that conflict in its whisper. It speaks of law and love, of justice and grace, of how heaven often hides its miracles in the most human of acts. Because the story of Tamar is not merely about what she did, it is about what God revealed through her doing. That sometimes righteousness is misunderstood, and holiness wears the veil of scandal to teach men humility. Soft pause. Distant thunder rumbles. The story was never meant to glorify deception, but to uncover divine irony, that the one deemed unclean became the vessel of purity's lineage. That the forgotten widow became the cornerstone of salvation's story. And as centuries passed, her blood would flow quietly through generations, through kings and shepherds, through rebels and poets, until it reached a young virgin in Nazareth, whose faith would echo Tamar's own. Courage born in darkness, belief against all reason, obedience through mystery. But before that prophecy could fully unfold, there was still more to be revealed. Secrets hidden in the scrolls, patterns only the wise could see. For every act in the story of Judah and Tamar cast a shadow into the future, a divine reflection that would one day explain why grace can never be confined by human law. Wind swells, a faint echo of footsteps through sand. And that, dear listener, is the heart of the conflict. Not between man and woman, but between law and mercy, between the seen and the unseen, for heaven's greatest justice often arrives in disguise. And when it does, the world trembles. Soft music fades, leaving the sound of distant wind. And that's when the prophecy began to take shape. The night was still, but heaven was restless. The stars above seemed to flicker like eyes that refused to close, and the moon hung low, watching, waiting. Somewhere in that silence, destiny stirred. Tamar, once cast aside, was no longer the broken widow who sat behind veils of shame. She had walked into the shadow, played her part in a deception that would soon be known across generations. Yet in her quiet heart she trembled, not from guilt but from awe. For what had just occurred was not merely an act of survival, it was prophecy awakening. She sat beneath a fig tree, her veil still in her lap, her breath uneven. The night air smelled of earth and judgment. Judah had gone unaware of the divine current he had stepped into. He thought it a moment of weakness, a sin whispered in the dark. But heaven had called it justice. Tamar whispered softly into her hands, "If I must be the vessel, then let truth come through me." And so it did. Weeks passed, and whispers began to rise through the village like smoke. Tamar's body began to change. Her form carried the unmistakable sign, life stirring within her womb. When Judah's household learned that his daughter-in-law was pregnant, fury swept through the courtyard. The same family that had silenced her now raised their voices in outrage. "By harlotry she has brought shame upon us," they cried. Judah, in his authority, gave the order without hesitation. "Bring her out," he commanded, "and let her be burned." It was the old law, swift, brutal, and unmerciful. The servants prepared the fire, and the air filled with dread. Tamar stood silent, her hands bound, her eyes cast downward not in shame but in calm surrender. She had known this moment would come. Every step of her path had been lit by both fear and faith, a dual fire that now burned around her feet. And then, with trembling hands, she revealed the tokens, the signet, the cord, and the staff. The very symbols of Judah's authority. "By the man to whom these belong," she said softly, "I am with child." The courtyard froze. The servants dropped their torches. The flames flickered, confused, unwilling to consume a woman shielded by truth. Judah's face drained of color. He knew those symbols, and they were his and his alone. The murmurs of the crowd fell away into silence. All eyes turned to him. He staggered back a step as though struck by lightning. And then, in a voice that broke the silence of centuries, he spoke the words that would echo through eternity. "She is more righteous than I." The words rippled through the air like thunder rolling through the desert. In that instant, the divine script flipped. The condemned became the justified. The deceiver became the vessel of divine order. Tamar had not defied God. She had fulfilled him. The woman who had been forgotten became the mirror through which man saw his own corruption. That night, Judah wept in solitude. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, not as a patriarch, but as a man who had failed both his duty and his heart. He had promised Tamar justice and given her abandonment. He had vowed righteousness and lived hypocrisy. Through her, he saw heaven's rebuke written in human form. But heaven did not condemn Judah alone. The greater purpose had already begun to bloom. For within Tamar's womb, two lives stirred, twins destined to divide history, Perez and Zerah. One would breach the line of kings, the other would carry the symbol of dawn. Even in birth, they struggled. Zerah's hand emerging first, tied with a scarlet thread by the midwife. Yet it was Perez who broke through, who burst forth unmarked, the true heir of divine will. From his line would come David, the shepherd king, and from David would come Christ. Thus, in the quiet chambers of a disgraced widow, the seed of salvation took root. Tamar, through what seemed like sin, became the unwitting guardian of prophecy. Her name, once whispered in scandal, would be written in the bloodline of redemption. In the heavens, angels recorded the moment with reverent silence. The same Tamar who had once been called cursed was now written into the lineage of the Messiah. The revelation did not come with trumpets or visions. It came through flesh, through birth, through the trembling cry of a newborn that split the night. It came through a woman whom the world had cast aside. Centuries later, scribes would argue over her name. Some would call her cunning, others bold. But those who read with the eyes of faith saw deeper. They saw that Tamar's deception was not rebellion but restoration. Her veil had not hidden sin, it had unveiled truth. In the divine script, her act was not a trick, but a mirror, reflecting the hypocrisy of men and the justice of God. For sometimes, heaven writes its truths in paradox. Through Tamar, the eternal balance of justice and mercy tilted back toward order. The punishment of the wicked became the redemption of the broken. And God, who sees beyond shame, made her story a prophecy of reversal, that from disgrace would come grace, and from rejection, divine acceptance. Even the dust of the earth seemed to hum with the realization that heaven's justice is not bound by the laws of men. In the flicker of the torches, in the gasp of the crowd, the unseen hand of God had turned humiliation into honor. Tamar would never boast of what she had done. She lived her remaining years quietly, watching her sons grow, one bearing the scarlet mark of the firstborn, the other carrying the invisible mark of divine favor. And though no scripture records her final days, it is said that when she closed her eyes, she did so in peace, for she had witnessed what few ever do, the moment when heaven itself rewrote human law. And even now, when her story is read, the wind seems to whisper her truth across the centuries. When men fail justice, God disguises it as a woman. The story of Tamar is no longer just a tale of deception, it is revelation itself, a window through which we see that God's plans are never bound by scandal or shame. He can turn even the most broken story into a lineage of light. And so, in the book of Matthew, her name stands among kings, the quiet widow who defied death to give birth to destiny. The one who proved that divine justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives veiled. And as the last sands of Judah's age fell through time, her legacy became the unseen thread that stitched redemption into the heart of humanity. Her truth had been revealed, not by miracle but by courage, not by prophecy spoken, but prophecy lived, and that's when the heavens fell silent, because the revelation was complete. The years passed, and the earth grew quiet again. The desert winds carried fewer whispers of Tamar's name. The people spoke of her less, not because they forgot, but because her story became something sacred, something they feared to utter aloud. Some called her righteous, others called her dangerous. To the men of Judah, she was a reminder that justice can wear a woman's face, and that frightened them, but heaven was not finished yet. Tamar's revelation was not the end. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling within Judah's own soul. He had spoken the words, "She is more righteous than I," but those words clung to him like dust he could never wash away. Every time he looked upon his sons, he saw the reflection of his sin and his salvation intertwined. Judah aged, and with the years came silence. His once commanding voice grew softer, his laughter less frequent. Some nights the servants would see him wander outside his tent, staring toward the hills where Tamar once lived, where her veil once caught the light of the moon. Perhaps he hoped to hear her voice in the wind again. Perhaps he sought forgiveness that words could not give. But the weight of divine truth is heavy, and Judah's household carried it like a shadow. His sons by other wives whispered among themselves, uneasy about the twin heirs, Perez and Zerah, whose birth had rewritten the line of inheritance. The bloodline of Judah was now intertwined with scandal, and yet, blessed, the elders of the tribe could not reconcile it. How, they asked, could the lineage of kings spring from deception? They could not see what heaven saw, that God had chosen the imperfect vessel to birth the perfect plan. In those days, faith was measured by obedience, not by understanding. And so Judah's repentance became his legacy. He never took Tamar as a wife, for shame and reverence coexisted within him. But he protected her, honored her sons, and never again spoke against a woman's cry for justice. That was his unspoken penance, a lifetime of humility carved out of a moment of revelation. Yet, even the divine script has turns unseen. Years later, as Judah lay upon his deathbed, the memory of Tamar returned to him with the clarity of fire. His sons gathered near, expecting blessings, expecting wealth, expecting the favor of the patriarch. But Judah's eyes burned not with greed nor fear, but with divine remembrance. He called for Perez, the son of Tamar, the one who had broken through first, whose very name meant breach. When the boy came, Judah placed his trembling hands upon his head and whispered, "From you, kings will rise." Perez looked up, confused. He could not yet understand that prophecy often sounds like madness to mortal ears. Judah smiled faintly, as if seeing through time. One day, he said, the world will know that what was born from disgrace was chosen by God. And then the last breath of the patriarch faded into the night. The tent fell silent. Outside, the desert winds began to shift again, as if the heavens themselves were exhaling. Tamar, though older now, felt that wind pass over her dwelling and knew. She closed her eyes and whispered, "It is done." But even as peace settled upon her far beyond the hills of Judah, the ripples of her story began to move across generations. Centuries later, her descendants, shepherds, warriors, kings, would rise and fall, their destinies echoing the same paradox that defined Tamar's life. From her line would come David, a man after God's own heart, yet also a sinner haunted by his own deception. From David's line would come Solomon, the wise king whose wisdom could not shield him from human frailty. And from their line would come a carpenter from Nazareth, whose mother, like Tamar, would bear a child misunderstood by the world yet chosen by heaven. The pattern was divine and deliberate. Tamar's act had set a precedent, that the holy often enters through the doorway of the unholy, that redemption often wears the disguise of disgrace, yet not all who carried her blood understood this mystery. Many fell into the same patterns of judgment that once condemned her. The kingdom of Judah, strong and proud, began to forget its own origins. The kings grew arrogant, blind to the fact that their throne existed only because one woman dared to challenge human injustice in the name of divine law, and so came the fall. The kingdom that Tamar's faith had indirectly birthed began to rot from within. Pride replaced humility. Law replaced love. The divine thread that once wove through the house of Judah began to fray. Prophets arose to warn them. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, voices crying in the wilderness, reminding the people of God's justice and mercy. But their cries fell upon deaf ears. The descendants of kings forgot that their royal blood was born of repentance, not privilege. And heaven, patient but unyielding, allowed them to crumble. Jerusalem burned. The temple was torn apart. The people were scattered, exiled to foreign lands. It was the harvest of arrogance, the echo of every man who ever believed his power outweighed his faith. Yet through the ashes, the scarlet thread of Tamar's line remained. A remnant survived, not of soldiers or scribes, but of faith. The same faith that burned quietly in a widow's heart beneath a fig tree long ago. Somewhere in Babylon, under a sky foreign and dim, a young girl carried a child in her arms and told him the story of their ancestor Tamar, the woman who defied shame to fulfill prophecy. "Remember her," she whispered, "because one day the same God who saw her will see you." And in that whisper the divine lineage endured, for even in ruin, God's pattern remained intact. Every fall carried the seed of renewal. Every disgrace hid a spark of redemption. The same paradox that began with Tamar repeated itself through history. The righteous falling, the broken rising, the unseen hand restoring balance again and again. The world called it coincidence. Heaven called it continuity. When men wrote of kings, they forgot the widow. When they built temples, they ignored the womb that carried their future. But God remembered. He always remembered. And that remembrance became the silent law of the ages, that no act done in the shadow of faith ever remains unseen. So when the people of Judah fell into exile, heaven did not mourn. It waited. Because the prophecy born in Tamar's defiance had not yet reached its full circle. Generations later, when a young virgin in Nazareth whispered, "Let it be unto me," the same divine fire that once filled Tamar's spirit ignited again. Another woman, misunderstood by the world, carried divine justice in her womb. And through her and through Mary, the prophecy of Tamar found its completion. The circle was closed. The deception of one woman became the redemption of all mankind. And in that, the fall was not an end, it was a turning point. A return to the truth that began beneath a fig tree, when a widow dared to defy shame in the name of righteousness. The wind that carried Tamar's name across the centuries now whispered through the manger where Christ would be born. A divine echo, soft but eternal. What man calls sin, heaven may call salvation. And that's when the heavens trembled once more, because the turning point of all creation had been written by a woman who refused to be silenced. The story of Tamar faded into the folds of time, like ink absorbed by the desert wind. Her name became a whisper in the scrolls and mentioned but rarely understood. Generations passed and the world changed its face again and again. Empires rose and fell. Languages vanished, prophets came and were forgotten. Yet somewhere in the divine pattern, Tamar's spirit lingered and quiet, patient, waiting for those who could still see beyond history, beyond shame, beyond what men call justice. For though her life had ended in silence, her story had not. The divine does not die when the body does. It continues, hidden, threaded through the unseen fabric of destiny. Beneath the ruins of ancient Judah, under the dust of forgotten temples, there are still whispers of her. The elders of old used to say that every time a woman defies injustice with faith, Tamar's name is spoken in heaven. They said the fig trees in the hills of Hebron still bloom longer than the others, as if remembering her. Tears. But the continuation of her story was not in trees or stones. It was in blood. When Mary of Nazareth carried the child promised by heaven, she too bore the same paradox that once defined Tamar. The villagers whispered about her, just as they had whispered about that widow long ago. They called her names, doubted her virtue, questioned her truth. But Mary, like Tamar, kept her silence. She understood that when the divine moves through you, the world will never understand. The line of Tamar had come full circle. The widow's deception had opened the door through which salvation itself would enter the world. And the scarlet thread tied around Zerah's hand became the eternal symbol of blood and grace, the same scarlet that would one day flow from the cross. But the hidden continuation did not stop there. For prophecy is a river that flows both forward and backward through time. Every era carries its own Tamar, unseen, uncelebrated, but chosen. There are the mothers who raise their children in silence, carrying the weight of injustice, yet refusing to curse heaven. There are the daughters who are cast aside but find strength not in revenge but in endurance. There are the women who speak truth to power even when the world turns away. Each one unknowingly echoes Tamar's defiance. Each one, in her quiet rebellion, becomes part of the same divine lineage of courage and faith. It is said among mystics that the spirit of Tamar visits the hearts of women who stand at the edge of despair, not as a ghost, but as a whisper. When they close their eyes and refuse to surrender to injustice, that whisper says, "Remember me. Remember that justice does not always come from men, but from God who sees." Perhaps that is why in the scriptures her story remains, not erased, not rewritten, but preserved with every flaw intact. The Bible does not cleanse her of scandal. It allows her humanity to remain raw, complex, and true, because truth itself is divine, even when it offends the order of men. And those who read deeply, who listen between the verses, begin to feel it, the pulse of a story that has never ended. Some archaeologists claim to have found a small tomb carved in limestone near the valley where Judah's tribe once dwelled. The inscription is faded, eroded by centuries, but one phrase can still be read beneath the dust. "Here rests the woman who revealed righteousness." No one can say with certainty that it is hers. Yet when the wind moves through the valley, the fig trees above it sway as if bowing in reverence. And sometimes, only sometimes, when the dusk settles over the hills, travelers swear they hear a voice in the wind, soft and distant, saying, "More righteous than I." That is how heaven keeps its stories, not in monuments but in echoes. Through the centuries, Tamar's hidden continuation became more than genealogy. It became prophecy in motion. Her act foreshadowed the very heart of divine justice, that the rejected will be chosen, the broken will be made whole, and the shamed will become sacred. Even scholars who study her story today feel that strange unease, as though her name carries more weight than the pages can hold. They debate her motives, her courage, her deception. Yet none can deny her place in the divine chain. In the Gospel of Matthew, when the lineage of Christ is recorded, only 5 women are mentioned among the long list of fathers and sons: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. Each one bore the mark of scandal in human eyes. Each one was wrapped in rumor, rejection, or sin, yet each became a vessel of salvation. Why? Because heaven's measure of righteousness is not purity of reputation, but purity of intent. Tamar's hidden continuation lives in that truth, that faith sometimes wears the face of defiance, that God's justice often begins where man's judgment ends. In every generation, her name rises again, through the widow who demands her inheritance, through the daughter who refuses silence, through the mother who stands alone in faith, and through them all, her story continues to breathe. If one listens closely, the pattern becomes clear. Tamar's deception revealed divine justice. Rahab's betrayal preserved divine mercy. Ruth's loyalty restored divine order. Bathsheba's grief bore divine kingship. And Mary's obedience birthed divine salvation. 5 women, 1 thread, woven through time by the same unseen hand. Each one carried a fragment of the same light. A light that began in the dark tent where Tamar veiled her face, waiting not for a man but for justice, and now, even as the world rushes forward into its own chaos, her story lingers like a quiet prophecy, reminding us that divine justice is patient, divine timing mysterious, and divine mercy always hidden in plain sight. Perhaps that is the real continuation, not in relics or ruins, but in the conscience of every soul who dares to believe that God still sees the unseen. And so the tale of Tamar ends not with death, but with legacy. She stands among the ancient figures, not a queen, not a prophetess, not a warrior, but something far rarer, a woman who forced the truth to reveal itself. And when the final trumpet sounds, when the scroll of time is rolled shut, her name will be read not with scandal but with reverence, for through her God showed that his justice is not bound by human law. It moves like the wind, silent but unstoppable, choosing the humble, the wounded, and the forgotten. That is the mystery of Tamar. That in deceiving man, she revealed the heart of God. The story is over, and yet it never truly ends. For every time truth is hidden and then revealed, somewhere, Tamar's spirit smiles, and that's when the prophecy begins again. The night of revelation came not with thunder, but with silence, the kind of silence that holds eternity inside it. It was said that heaven itself grew still, for the story of Tamar had reached its divine echo. Her name, once buried in scandal, had become the key that unlocked a truth so ancient, so mysterious, that even the prophets spoke of it only in fragments. For generations, scholars and seekers had asked, why did God choose her, a widow? A deceiver, a forgotten woman, was to bear the root of redemption? Why would the Messiah's bloodline begin not with purity, but with deception? And the answer, whispered through centuries of prayer and revelation, was this: because divine justice does not fear human scandal. In heaven's eyes, Tamar was never a sinner, but a mirror, a reflection of humanity's failure and of God's unstoppable mercy. When men refused her justice, she became the vessel through which God restored it. Her act was not rebellion, but prophecy disguised as survival. That is the revelation hidden beneath her veil, that heaven often cloaks its holiest purposes in the garments of imperfection. The law of men said she was impure. The law of heaven said she was chosen, and that single paradox reshaped the destiny of the world. For centuries, the story of Tamar lay in the background of Scripture, a faint heartbeat beneath the roaring stories of kings and prophets. But when Matthew wrote the genealogy of Christ, the heartbeat grew loud again. It was no accident that Tamar's name stood among the 5 women mentioned, each one marked by scandal, yet sanctified by divine purpose. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Mary, together, they formed the hidden covenant of divine femininity, a covenant not of power or perfection, but of grace through defiance. Tamar stood for justice. Rahab stood for faith. Ruth stood for loyalty. Bathsheba stood for repentance. Mary stood for obedience. 5 women, 5 reflections of heaven's compassion. And at the root of it all stood Tamar, the widow who refused to be forgotten. Through her, the divine revealed that the line of salvation would not be born through royalty or ritual, but through brokenness redeemed. Tamar was not just part of Christ's ancestry. She was the spiritual prototype of it. Her deception was a shadow of a future mystery. That truth would one day wear the face of sacrifice, and salvation would come disguised as shame. When Judah declared, "She is more righteous than I," he unknowingly spoke for all of humanity. Those words were the prophecy of every sinner who would one day kneel before grace. In that moment, Tamar became the first symbol of divine reversal, where the guilty are justified, and the forgotten become foundations, and so the revelation unfolds. God's greatest truths often hide in contradiction. A barren widow gives birth to kings. A condemned man becomes a redeemer. A cross meant for death becomes the gateway to life. Tamar's deception, Rahab's betrayal, Ruth's risk, Bathsheba's sorrow, Mary's submission, each act carried the echo of the same divine pattern. The world's shame transformed into heaven's glory. Theologians search for signs, historians for proof, but the revelation of Tamar is not found in ruins or relics. It is found in the pulse of every act of unseen righteousness, every time the powerless speak truth, every time a woman refuses to be silenced, every time a heart broken by injustice still dares to trust in God. That is where Tamar lives. That is where revelation breathes, for the divine does not record events as humans do. It records intent. Tamar's heart, though judged by men, was seen by God as pure fire. Defiant, yes, but aligned with heaven's justice. She did what the righteous men around her would not. She fulfilled the promise they forgot, and through her, God revealed that divine order is not upheld by titles or thrones, but by courage and faith. Imagine her now, standing not as a widow but as a matriarch of prophecy. Her veil no longer a symbol of shame but of mystery revealed. The light of eternity shining through her eyes, her voice echoing through the generations of believers. When justice sleeps, faith must awaken it. That is the eternal truth of Tamar's story, a revelation hidden within history. When Mary bore Christ into the world, Tamar's lineage reached its divine fulfillment. The scarlet thread tied around Zerah's hand became the symbol of blood and redemption. The same thread that marked a child in the womb of a widow now marked the covenant on the cross. Tamar's act gave rise to Perez, the breach, and through him came David, the king who danced before God. Through David came Christ, the king who wept for mankind. The breach Tamar created in human law became the breach through which divine grace entered human history. And when Christ cried out, "It is finished," the echo reached all the way back to the hills of Judah, to a woman who once waited beneath a fig tree, with a veil over her face and courage in her heart. Heaven had completed what she began. In that single cry, the story of humanity was rewritten. What began with shame ended with salvation. The widow's deception had become the doorway of divine truth. This is the great revelation, that God never wastes suffering. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every unjust silence, and all of it can become holy in His timing. Tamar's story is proof that heaven can turn even our darkest choices into light when they are made in the pursuit of righteousness. And so the veil that once covered her face now covers us, not as a mark of shame, but as a sign of mystery. The mystery that God uses the weak to shame the strong, the broken to heal the whole, and the forgotten to write His greatest works even now. If one listens in prayer, in solitude, in silence, one might hear it, the echo of her story across time. Justice is not always pure, but it is always divine. And that is the revelation the world was never ready to accept. That holiness is not found in perfection, but in redemption. Tamar's deception was heaven's prophecy in disguise, and the blood of kings, prophets, and the Messiah himself would flow through the line she began. The scrolls of men record her as a widow, but the scrolls of heaven record her as the first breach, the one through whom divine justice entered the world. And that's when the light broke through the silence, not as fire, not as thunder, but as understanding. Because in the eyes of God, Tamar never sinned. She revealed Him. Centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, prophets spoke and vanished into dust. Yet Tamar's shadow lingered in every sacred lineage, every whispered prayer for justice. Her name, once spoken with pity, became a sacred riddle among the wise. The question that unites every soul who has ever been wronged but still dares to believe in divine fairness. And this is where her true legacy begins, not in the act itself, but in what it taught heaven and earth about each other. When Tamar vanished into the scrolls of time, she left behind more than sons. She left behind a code, a divine principle hidden within her defiance. That faith is not obedience to silence, but obedience to truth. Judah's lineage prospered, and generations later, when David was born, his blood carried that same fire, a fire inherited from a woman who refused to let the promise die. And through David came the promise fulfilled. a king not of this world, who would carry the same paradox Tamar once embodied, righteousness through scandal, purity through pain. Every mother of Israel carried a trace of her. Every woman who fought for her right to be heard carried her courage. Every man who bowed his pride to admit fault like Judah did, echoed her redemption. Her story was not one of rebellion. It was the blueprint of divine justice wrapped in human imperfection. Think of it. Tamar had no temple, no priest, no angel's voice to guide her. Only silence, only waiting, only faith that somehow the God who sees all would vindicate her. And he did, not through immediate miracle, but through generations of mercy. Perez, her son, the breach, became the ancestor of kings. His very name symbolized the pattern of God's work, breaking through boundaries the world declared impossible. Perez to Hezron, Hezron to Ram, Ram to Aminadab, Aminadab to Nahshon, the leader of Israel's tribes, from Nahshon to Boaz, who married Ruth, another foreign widow redeemed by divine providence. From Boaz to Obed, from Obed to Jesse, from Jesse to David, and from David to Christ, the Son of Man, whose mercy breached the divide between heaven and earth. Each generation carried the echo of Tamar's courage. Each act of faith, each moment of divine reversal, was a living reflection of that one night under the veil, and perhaps, when Mary first heard the angel's voice and whispered, "Be it unto me according to thy word," heaven smiled, because once again, a woman was accepting divine mystery with fearless faith. Tamar's legacy had come full circle. She began the story of grace through scandal. Mary completed it. But the world still wrestles with her. Even now, scholars debate, was Tamar righteous or deceitful? And that is exactly why her story still breathes, because she cannot be confined by our moral comfort. She exists in the divine tension between law and mercy, between justice and compassion. Her story dares to ask every believer, when you are wronged, will you stay silent, or will you act in faith that God's justice can move through your courage? Tamar's faith was active, not passive. It did not sit and wait for permission. It believed that if God had promised justice, then silence in the face of injustice was itself disobedience. That is her hidden legacy, one not of rebellion, but of partnership with the divine, and so, her name reappears not just in genealogies but in hearts, the hearts of women who rise from ashes, the hearts of men who learn humility through repentance, the hearts of all who choose righteousness over reputation. Because the truth is, the story of Tamar was never about one woman. It was about the revelation that God's justice is never late, only layered. Her deception revealed that the line between sinner and saint is often drawn by those who understand neither. Her silence taught that waiting on God does not mean surrendering to cruelty. Her courage proved that heaven measures faith not by fear but by intent. When we speak her name now, we do not whisper it with judgment. We speak it with awe. Because through her, heaven changed the rules. It showed that no voice is too small, no act too scandalous, no life too broken to become the seed of redemption. The sages once wrote, "Tamar bore twins, but the world was born again through her." And indeed, her twin sons became the symbol of dual truth. Zerah, whose scarlet thread marked him first, and Perez, who broke through to light. The visible and the hidden, the law and the grace, the seen and the divine, both born of the same womb, the same mystery. Tamar's womb became the battlefield between tradition and transformation, and heaven chose transformation. Now imagine her, aged, yet serene, sitting in the quiet of her later years. The scandal has faded. Her sons have grown, the world has moved on, yet somewhere deep inside her she knows. She knows that what she did was more than survival. It was a covenant sealed in faith. Maybe she walks under the stars sometimes, the same stars Abraham once counted, and whispers, "I kept the promise alive," and the wind, carrying heaven's answer, replies, "Yes, daughter of justice, you did." That is her legacy, the courage to carry faith through darkness without proof, to act when no one else would, to trust that righteousness would find her, even if it came disguised as shame. Tamar's story teaches that faith is not fragile. It is fierce. It wrestles with God's silence until the blessing breaks through. And to those who read her story today, the widows, the voiceless, the forgotten, the falsely judged, her voice still whispers, Your story is not over. Justice may be slow, but it is never still. Every scar, every betrayal, every unjust silence can still become holy if it leads you closer to truth. For Tamar's God is still alive, and he still sees. The woman they called a deceiver became the ancestor of redemption. The widow they condemned became the first breach of grace, and that is why her name, though ancient, still burns bright, a light for every generation that refuses to give up faith when heaven feels far. Tamar's legacy is not written in gold or prophecy. It is written in courage, in every act of quiet defiance that says, "I believe justice will come." And in the great unfolding story of salvation, her name is no longer whispered in scandal. It is proclaimed in glory, because the line that began in her womb became the line that bore the Savior. A forgotten widow became the mother of kings. A veiled deceiver became the face of divine justice, and through her, through that one act of desperate faith, the world learned a truth that still changes lives. God's grace does not wait for perfection. It moves through courage, and so every time you fight for truth when it costs you everything, every time you choose righteousness over reputation, every time you trust God in silence, you walk the same path Tamar once walked, the path of the forgotten who are remembered by heaven, the path of the broken who become the bridge, the path of divine justice hidden in human form. That is her eternal legacy, Tamar, the woman who turned scandal into salvation. The night grows still. The candles flicker low. The desert wind whispers through the fig trees where Tamar once walked, and the echo of her steps seems to merge with the pulse of time itself. It is here in this sacred quiet that her story finally breathes its last word, not in tragedy but in triumph. For what began as humiliation ended as holiness. What began in deceit ended in divine purpose, and what seemed like rebellion was all along faith in disguise. Tamar's story is not meant to be understood quickly. It is meant to be felt, because in her silence there is every cry of the oppressed. In her courage there is every act of faith that rises from ashes. In her justice there is the hand of God, and unseen yet unyielding. When we look upon her, we are forced to ask, how often does heaven work through those we dismiss? How often does God's justice look nothing like what we expect? We often imagine divine intervention as thunder, lightning, or a booming voice from the clouds. But Tamar's story reminds us that sometimes the miracle is a woman who refuses to let injustice become her tomb. She had no weapon but faith, no power but persistence, no crown but courage, and through her the promise continued. Through her the lineage of redemption flowed unbroken, all the way to Bethlehem. Even now, when you open the Gospel of Matthew and trace the genealogy of Christ, her name gleams among the chosen few, Tamar, not forgotten, not erased, written into eternity by the very God who saw her pain. That alone is the revelation, that heaven does not reject the flawed, the misunderstood, or the desperate. Heaven transforms them. Perhaps that is why her story feels so modern, because even today there are Tamars walking among us, unseen, unheard, yet holding faith in their trembling hands. Women who have been silenced by society but still raise their children in hope. Men who repent as Judah did and choose humility over pride. Souls who refuse to let injustice have the final word. The divine does not look at our appearance or circumstance. It looks at our intent. Tamar's act was not born of rebellion. It was born of belief. And belief, when pure, can rewrite destiny. So what do we learn from her? That faith sometimes demands action. That silence can be holy, but courage can be sacred too. That God's justice may walk slowly, but it never walks away. Her story reminds us that divine timing is rarely comfortable, yet it is always perfect. There is a moment in every life when we stand at the crossroads between despair and faith, between surrender and persistence. And in that moment, Tamar's spirit still whispers through time. Do not be afraid to do what is right, even if the world does not understand. She was not a queen, not a prophet, not a priestess, but she became the vessel of promise. Because she believed that justice could still be born through her pain. And maybe that's what faith truly is. Not waiting for the storm to pass, but believing that even in the storm, God is still writing your story. Her legacy teaches us to stop dividing stories into holy and human. Because the truth is, every holy story begins in human struggle. The divine works not above us, but through us. When we fall, God shapes our fall into a step. When we are shamed, He turns our shame into testimony. When we are forgotten, He writes our names where no hand can erase them. That is the heartbeat of Tamar's tale. That redemption is not a clean path, but a sacred climb through shadow and light. So tonight, as her story closes, imagine her spirit resting in peace, not as the deceiver history once painted her, but as a daughter of courage who kept the promise alive when everyone else gave up. She stands now among the matriarchs of faith: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth, Mary, not lesser, not greater, but equal in grace. Each bore the weight of destiny in her own way, and together, they remind us that heaven's greatest works often begin in broken places. And so her story returns to you, the listener, the seeker. Because her journey is not over until you decide what it means in your life. Will you wait in silence like Tamar? Will you fight for righteousness even when misunderstood? Will you believe that divine justice still breathes through the cracks of your pain? Her story is a mirror, and somewhere within it, you might find your own reflection. Because every human soul has its Tamar moment. That night of faith in disguise. That act of courage when no one else understands. That cry for justice that heaven hears before the world does. And when that moment comes, remember her. Remember the widow who refused to be forgotten. Remember the woman whose faith turned scandal into salvation. Because if God could use Tamar to bring forth the line of kings, then He can use your story too, no matter how broken, no matter how misunderstood. For the same God who saw her still sees you. The same mercy that moved for her still moves for you. And the same promise that began in her womb still lives in every heart that believes in justice, faith, and divine grace. If this story of Tamar touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that divine justice never sleeps. Every act of courage, every silent prayer, every tear unseen, heaven still sees it all. Tell me in the comments what this story awakened in you, and how faith has guided your own battles. And if you wish to keep walking through the hidden mysteries of Scripture, through tales of faith, prophecy, and redemption, subscribe to Legends of Bible. Together, we'll keep uncovering the divine secrets written between the lines of time.